Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear viewers, this is Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path, my journey to Islam and what happened to me as I went through life. And we're in Russia at the moment, and we're in Uzbekistan, specifically Samarkand, and we're just about to leave Samarkand and go to Bukhara. And in Bukhara we had a cultural program and also met with some people that were trying to do business. We saw various sites of interest, but I'm not going to dwell too much on that, because what I would like to say more about it is that one time in the UK, a doctor friend of mine, his father passed away, who was in Uzbekistan, and he asked me to come and say a few words to the group. And I did, and I mentioned our experiences in Uzbekistan. And the interesting thing for me was that there were 7 Uzbekis actually in the audience, and one of them was an imam. And I said to him afterwards that perhaps you should have done this, not me. He said, no, he said it was instructive that we heard someone else talking about our country rather than we talk about it ourselves. So that was quite nice, and it was quite pleasant, alhamdulillah. While we were there, they were actually reclaiming the mosques in Samarkand and Bukhara in Uzbekistan, and they were costing about $500 to actually do them up again as mosques. They'd opened a few madrasas, and I think 4 mosques were actually active in Samarkand when we were there. And in actual fact, in Bukhara, we actually donated just for another mosque to be built. And at one time they sent us a little video which showed the construction of the mosque and how big it was, and they called it Masjid-e Daud. Alhamdulillah. Anyway, from there we went to, from Bukhara we went to Novosibirsk, which is in Siberia, and we were flying over the Ural Sea, and the interpreters were explaining that they found that one side of the sea was seawater and the other side of the Ural Sea was actually sweet water, and that they didn't mix. And we told them this is exactly in the Quran, that the two waters don't mix, the sweet water and the salt water. And similarly with Bahrain, of course, it's 2 seas, that's what it means, Bahrain, okay, so it's 2 seas, and this is it. The divers, when they were diving for pearls, they used to go down and they could actually bring up sweet water in a cup that they could drink. In other words, they were proving that you could actually find water that didn't mix with the salt water, and you could drink it just from its source like that. Okay, so that was the sort of thing that we told them. Well, this is in the Quran. They were kind of surprised. But anyway, then in Novosibirsk there was a university, and what had happened is that they had built these cities all across Siberia, sort of 100 miles apart, and Novosibirsk was one of them, and it was a university town, and they wanted to take what the universities were producing in terms of ideas and put them into a product form, and then commercialize that product, in other words, sell it and find an outlet for it. So to set up a business unit, and the head of that business unit invited us to his house for dinner one evening, and we were talking, and out of that came an offer for me to work in Siberia, which I wasn't keen on because it was so cold. But the idea was that I would go there for 6 months, and they did in fact go as far as trying to get the visa from Moscow and send me an email to say that they had in fact applied for it. But then basically the USSR fell apart, so Moscow didn't have this say over these places so much, and that was the end of it. But in a way I was happy, because I didn't want to go. Okay, but from our experiences in Russia, we actually made contact with Muslims, and we kept writing to some of them. Okay, and in one case I sent a video on the life of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which I've mentioned in a previous episode, and one of the young men over there, he could explain the English in the Uzbeki language, and so his family was watching it, and then it was shown to a wider audience, and they were very happy because they hadn't seen these sorts of things. So he also was going to go to the States and take some sort of qualifications, and in fact I sent him a little bit of money, which he was very grateful for. So we did these sort of things and kept up with some other people just as long as we could. But eventually, of course, it falls apart because it takes so long for the letters to get from Russia to Saudi Arabia. But we did it as long as we could. And also I was talking to people who had been to Russia as da'is, and how they got in, how they got out and things like that. So it was an ongoing thing, but Islam was actually coming back, and we could see that ourselves. And of course now more and more things are happening. People are coming out from Uzbekistan, for instance, and other satellite countries to learn about Islam and go back and teach people back home. So alhamdulillah, it was a good experience for us. It was a cultural experience, and we saw things that we wouldn't normally have seen. We met people that we would never have come in contact with, and alhamdulillah, it was an eye-opener in many, many ways. Okay, just to give an example, industry wasn't very well developed in Uzbekistan. They sell the cotton as raw cotton. They delay these schools so that everyone can go out and pick the cotton, for instance, and only 20% is kept in the country, and the 80% raw material is actually sold to Israel. Okay. In terms of skins, they make a lot of boots and shoes. You could see pictures of the skins actually staked out or laid out in fields, just drying in the sun, just being cured in the sun. So, you know, in some ways you could say it's a bit primitive, okay? But of course, what do you expect? They were the food basket for the whole of the USSR, basically. And the market, there wasn't many goods there when we went there, but there was a lot of fruit and a lot of bread. And that was nice to see. And of course, I mentioned I had melon earlier from one of the guards, Timur's tomb, and there were quite a variety of melons and a lot of them. So that was something that was plenty there, alhamdulillah. So we had a good time, and in one place, when I got to Bukhara, I wanted to pray, and I said to one of the interpreters, look, I want to pray Fajr in a mosque if I can. And the man said to me, you phone me in the morning when you get up and I will come and take you. Okay, so this was his way of making sure that I got up and he didn't have to come for a wasted trip, I guess. But anyway, I phoned him and he came, and he took me to this mosque. And this was the mosque which was the only place which was open under the communists, where they used to train the imams and the muezzins for the whole of the USSR. And they closed all the places except this one. And we prayed in this particular mosque, and afterwards he said, look, I want to invite you for breakfast and your family as well. So we came back to the hotel, collected my wife, and then we went to his house and we had breakfast. His wife was a school teacher, he was a photographer. Okay, and we had breakfast, and of course then we left and we went back and joined our group, alhamdulillah. But you know, this was a sort of friendship that was developing, and I was in correspondence with him for a little while afterwards too. But as I mentioned, the delay in getting the letters backwards and forwards meant that whatever you were talking about had gone by in general. So it became a little bit difficult to actually correspond in a time sequence. So basically it just fell apart, frankly. But anyway, alhamdulillah, that was a sort of experience in Russia. And when we came back from Russia, we came through Turkey, and a friend of mine, well, someone who worked for me was a friend of mine, a Turkish guy, and he had a friend who ran like a tourist agency, and he got someone to take us around in Turkey. And this guy actually turned out to be speak 5 languages. He was an interpreter, but he wasn't praying. And when we used to go to the mosque to pray, I'd do wuzu and wait for him, and he wouldn't come, so I'd go and pray. And one day he was doing this, and my wife said to him, my husband waits for you to pray, why don't you go and pray with him? Oh, does he? Oh. So in fact he actually joined me from then on. Whenever I went to pray, he would come and pray. And when we went back to Saudi, we were in contact with him, and he said that he joined this man's company, and he was now praying 5 times a day. Alhamdulillah. So, you know, you can have some sort of influence on people, even when you think they're completely opposed to you, just by example. And of course, this is the real way that the da'i works. It's not just what you say, it's what you do as well. If you're not living up to what you're saying, how can anyone expect to follow what you're trying to persuade them to do? Anyway, alhamdulillah. So with this, we come to the end of this part, and inshallah we'll meet again soon after a short break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear viewers, let me welcome you to the second part of this episode on Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. There's one or two other comments I'd like to make about Russia before I move on. We had taken some small Qurans with us in our luggage to be able to give to people, perhaps, when we were there. And in Bukhara in particular, one of the maids that was cleaning the room saw my wife reading one, and she said to her, "Is it a Quran?" She said, "Yes." She said, "Can I get one?" And of course we were happy to give her one, actually 2. So you could give one to someone else as well. And that was a little bit of a surprise, but they could read Arabic, and you know, and that was a good sign. So alhamdulillah, that was another link with, if you like, Islam and the Islamic past before the communists came. So they had preserved quite a lot of their traditions in this way. And when we were in the airport in Moscow, it was time for prayer, and we wanted to pray, so we just prayed, and no one said anything. And in Bukhara at one time, we were about to move, and we said to the interpreters, "We'd like to pray before we go." They said, "It's all right, just go into space there and do it." So, you know, there was no problem. So we could actually just pray without any problems. But we were, in fact, tourists, so that might have been a special circumstance, I don't know. But at least we didn't have any problems. There was no hassle. And then we came back from Moscow to Turkey en route to Saudi Arabia. And while we were in Turkey, I mentioned something about the Turkish guide, but we also went round a lot of the sites that we could, including Bursa, which was the old site for the Caliphate before it was moved to Istanbul. So we actually saw quite a few things of interest and met a few people as well. My friend had given us 1 or 2 contacts, and we stayed in the old part of the city, which again was the religious part, Al-Fatih. So it was quite an experience, and it was good to be in the country and see it. And of course we saw the Blue Mosque and the Suleymaniya Mosque and so on and so forth. And so as many sites as we could. We went around the Topkapi Museum, which was very interesting. But we also went round the women's quarters, the harem as it's called, and we were surprised because in these rooms there was, like, in one room there was a qul in each corner, an ayah from the Quran in each corner, and the impression you get is that there's no religion in the harem, and everything's talked about as though it's almost depravity. And in another room we were told this is where the ladies used to dance, and there wouldn't be an orchestra, but the people that would play the music, they were up in the ceiling, above what would have been the ceiling, which was just a small area, and they were out of sight. They couldn't look down on where the ladies were dancing. So when you see these things in practice, you begin to wonder whether what's been said about the harem has actually got any truth behind it, or whether it's fictitious. And we were surprised by what we saw and what we were told compared to what we had understood from the harem before. Yes, it's possible there is depravity, okay, that's always possible, but there's also another side to it as well. Why would they put ayahs from the Quran on the walls of a room if they were going to do depraved acts, for instance? Why would they put the musicians out of sight of the women and that they couldn't see the women if there was going to be dancing just for the women, and so on? So when you start to look at it like this, you begin to think that there is another side to it, and that the people who have been talking about it haven't actually been in and seen the situation for themselves. So that was a minor surprise for us. But it was educational as well, and it's something we can talk about from experience, alhamdulillah, and that's much better than something we read. So we were happy with that, and then we came back to Saudi after a few days, really. I think we had about 4 days. But we were glad that we went. There's a lot to see in Turkey. We would have liked to have seen outside of Istanbul and Bursa, but at least we came back from Bursa by bus. And in the bus we started to talk to some of the people that were in the bus with us, and as far as those that knew English, they were mainly students. And that again was quite an experience, because it's a cultural exchange after all. And what are we trying to do if we're not on a cultural trip, which is what we were when we went to Russia? So alhamdulillah, we had a lot of experiences like this, and we travelled quite a lot. Even in Pakistan, we used to go to Pakistan almost every year, and we'd go to a nephew and maybe a niece, and where we could, we would take them up to the north of Pakistan. So we'd go up to Islamabad or to Murree, and we'd pick up with a tourist agency, and from Murree we went on one particular trip to Balakot, which is the site of where the Muslims who tried to establish an Islamic State when the British were there. It failed, and it failed miserably, but the site was there, and we went when we saw that. And then from Balakot we transferred from the minibus to jeeps, and now we went up into the mountains. And we actually went up to Naran, and from Naran, that's where the road ends, and we went up by horseback to Saif al-Muluk, which was about 12,000 feet above sea level. So it was quite an experience for that, and also being on horseback and going over the glaciers and so on. And then of course we came back down, and we'd spent quite a good trip there. So alhamdulillah, and that's actually being developed for tourism now. They've got hotels, and you can get different types of food there, and accommodation is quite good. So there are these areas now where you can do these trips, but Saif al-Muluk now doesn't exist after the avalanche and the floods that came. But and I'm not sure about Balakot. A lot of that was washed away as well, but I haven't been back since. But it's not as it was, that's for sure. But at least we saw it when it was, and we had quite a lot of Pakistan. We saw Islamabad, Abbottabad, Ayubia, and so on and so forth, Peshawar and various other places, as well as Lahore and Karachi. So alhamdulillah, we've seen quite a lot, and we toured quite a lot. We were doing all this together. We were never separated. We always went together wherever it was, and in that sense it was something that we understood and appreciated, because we both liked to travel. And even in Saudi, the Saudis used to say to us that you've seen more of Saudi Arabia than we have, because we used to travel so much. Basically, I'd drive down any road that was there until it came to the end. And I had a funny little idiosyncrasy, if you like. I used to send a letter back to myself, so we used to try to find the post offices in these out-of-the-way places and send a letter back to myself so I could get the cancel on the postage stamp, okay, so that we had some idea of where we'd been. Only some of them, they didn't put the actual name of the place on it. It was like, this is a field post office, and these were quite interesting places, because they were having a construction site somewhere near, building a road or something, and they would set up a post office for the construction workers. And it would just be a field office, nothing really. But it was interesting, and I had joined the Saudi Arabian Philatelic Society, and I knew one or two people there, and they used to go along and get some stamps and whatever, and so I collected Saudi stamps, because the postal history of a country is also quite interesting. For instance, it would tell us about the Ottoman occupation in Mecca of the post office that were actually handled by the Turks, and then of course in Medina, and so on and so forth. And then there was the unification of Saudi Arabia. So these sort of things are all through the postal history as well. So you can actually get some idea of the history of the country from just the postal history. So it became quite interesting in a way, but of course it becomes expensive if you go into it too deeply, and I didn't do that, but I did have a collection. And then I had one of the cartographers actually produced a map of Saudi Arabia, which was quite large scale, and what I could do was I could link up these letters that I sent back to myself, the cancels, with where it was on the map. So I actually had done that, and that was something of interest at the time. But since I've been back in the UK, I've got rid of all of this now. But at least it was some way of keeping a memory and understanding where we'd been and following some of these trips up and looking at them, because we, as I say, we used to just drive down the road till it came to the end. And when it came to the end, we'd sort of turn around and come back. But some of them, it was quite interesting because there'd be a village at the end, and to go to the post office, and in most cases, the postman or the person in the post office would say to me, "Have some refreshment with me, have some coffee or something," you know. And sometimes I could, and sometimes I couldn't, because remember the wife was in the car, so I wouldn't take her into the post office. And occasionally the other side of the coin appeared, because the women might be sitting out in the garden or the front of the post office, and my wife would take the letter in, and she would be invited to sit and have tea or coffee with them. So that was the other way around. So it worked both ways, alhamdulillah. And with that, I think we come to the end of this episode. So until we meet again, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.